What would you do if you walked into a room full of the most dangerous men in the city wearing the wrong dress, felt every hungry eye in the place crawl over your body for an hour, and then, without a single word, the most feared man alive stood up, took off his own jacket, crossed the entire room, and laid it over your bare shoulders? She felt every eye in that room before she ever felt his jacket. She felt them the way you feel heat off a fire, the way prey feels the shape of the thing hunting it. And she had spent the whole night shrinking, making herself smaller, wishing the marble floor would open and take her. And then the noise of the room simply stopped, because a man whose name made powerful people nervous had risen from his chair, and what he did next rearranged the balance of the entire evening. This is a story of hidden worth, quiet protection, and the ruthless man who decided that the woman everyone was looking at wrong was the only one in the room worth looking at right. Delia Frost had not wanted to come. She was a soft, generously curved woman of 29 with a warm face and a habit of apologizing for the space she took up, and she was, of all the unglamorous things, an accountant. The quiet backroom bookkeeper for a shipping company she had slowly come to understand was not really a shipping company at all. She kept her head down and her ledgers perfect and her opinions to herself, and for 2 years that had been enough to stay invisible, which was exactly how Delia liked it. But tonight her boss had needed a number checker at a private gathering, someone to sit in a back room and verify figures during a high-stakes deal between families, and he had told her, at 4 in the afternoon with no time to argue, that she was coming, and that she should look presentable. Delia owned one dress that could be called presentable. It was newer than she was comfortable with, a short wine-red thing a cousin had talked her into, cut higher on the thigh and lower at the neckline than anything she would ever have chosen for herself, and she had spent the whole car ride tugging it down and wishing she had said no. She had imagined a quiet back office. She had not imagined a ballroom, and she had certainly not imagined walking, in that dress, into a room full of the most dangerous men on the coast, every one of whom turned to look at her the moment she stepped through the doors and did not look away. What none of them saw, behind the dress and the blush and the tugged hem, was the sharpest mind in that entire building. Delia Frost could read a ledger the way other people read a face. She had a memory that forgot nothing and a talent for numbers that had kept a criminal enterprise's books clean enough to survive 3 audits, and she noticed everything, every face, every exchange, every account that did not reconcile. She had been brought to that gathering to be useful and invisible, a calculator in a corner. But the mind behind the blush was a rare and dangerous thing. 2 years of keeping a criminal enterprise's books had taught her to read money the way a doctor reads an X-ray, to see the fracture under the smooth surface, and she had quietly caught 3 men stealing from the company before anyone above her ever suspected a thing, and said nothing, because a bookkeeper who noticed too much did not stay invisible for long, and invisible was how she had survived. She had no idea that the dress would make her the most watched woman in the room, or that being watched was about to save her life, because the men staring at her that night were not all staring for the reason she thought. The gathering was a summit, the kind of evening where alliances were made and men occasionally did not walk back out, held in a private hall of dark wood and old money, and Delia had never felt more out of place in her life. She had been shown to a small table near the back and given a folder of figures to check, and she had bent over them gratefully, hiding in the work, but every time she looked up she found eyes on her. Powerful men in dark suits, capos and enforcers and rival bosses, let their gazes travel over her bare shoulders and her exposed thigh with an open, predatory interest that made her skin crawl. Some of them smiled. One of them, a heavy man with cold eyes across the room, watched her with a fixed, patient attention that frightened her more than the leering, though she could not have said why. She tugged her hem down for the 100th time. She crossed her arms. She wished she had a cardigan, a coat, a curtain, anything. And at the head of the long table, in the seat no one dared approach uninvited, a man had been watching the whole thing with a stillness that was slowly turning into something colder. Dario Rourke was the reason the room had a temperature. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the docks, and the fear of every family for 100 miles, a man rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely spoke. He missed nothing. And for the better part of an hour he had sat at the head of that table and watched the men in his hall look at the nervous, curvy woman in the back like wolves circling a lamb, and he had watched her shrink under it, fold her arms, tug at a hem, try with everything she had to disappear, and something in his cold, guarded face had been getting quieter and harder by the minute. He was not looking at her the way the others were. He was watching her hands, steady and quick over the figures despite her fear. He was watching her catch something in the folder, a small frown, a recheck. He was watching the one person in that room of 100 who was actually working and being devoured for the crime of having been handed the wrong dress. Then the heavy man with the cold eyes rose from his seat and began, with a leisurely, entitled certainty, to cross the room toward her. And Dario Rourke set down his glass. He did not shout. He did not signal. He simply stood, and the small movement pulled every eye in the hall, because when Dario Rourke stood, rooms went quiet. He shrugged out of his charcoal suit jacket, the fine fabric sliding off his broad shoulders, and he crossed the entire length of that silent hall, past the frozen capos, past the heavy man who stopped mid-stride and thought better of the last 3 steps, and he stopped in front of Delia Frost, who looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, certain she had done something wrong. And without a single word, Dario Rourke lifted his jacket and settled it gently over her bare shoulders. The warmth of it swallowed her, far too big, smelling of cedar and tobacco, and something darker underneath, and Delia clutched it closed over herself with both hands, stunned. The whole room was staring now, but at him, not at her. Dario straightened and turned, unhurried, to face the hall, and let his dead, flat gaze travel slowly around every man who had spent the last hour looking at her, and he said, in a voice pitched soft enough that they all had to strain, and cold enough that they all went still, "Is there something interesting back here?" It was not a question. It was the last warning any of them would get. Nobody stared after that. Men found their drinks, their shoes, the ceiling, anything but the woman in the corner wrapped in the boss's jacket. 100 of the most dangerous people on the coast had just watched Dario Rourke give up his own coat and cross a room for a nervous bookkeeper, and every one of them understood, in that instant, that the temperature of the whole city had shifted, though not one of them yet knew why. And Dario looked down at Delia, and for just a moment the lethal mask softened into something she could not read. "Finish your numbers," he said quietly. "No one in this room will trouble you again." Then he walked back to the head of the table, and Delia sat there drowning in warm charcoal wool, her heart hammering, and understood that the most dangerous man in the city had just crossed a room full of killers to hand her his own coat. She had no idea that in doing it, he had marked her, and that a man who marks a woman as his own draws every enemy he is straight to her door. The gathering ended without blood, which the older men agreed was a mercy, and Delia tried to slip out quietly with the boss's jacket folded over her arm, meaning to have it cleaned and returned through channels. She did not make it to the door. Dario Rourke was waiting for her in the marble foyer, and he fell into step beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and he did not ask. He simply had his car brought around and opened the door and waited, and Delia, who had spent her whole life doing what powerful people told her, got in. In the dim cabin, he poured a measure of amber whiskey from a console decanter and pressed it into her hands. "Drink," he said. "You are shaking." She was. She took a swallow, the burn steadying her, and finally found her voice. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The jacket. I would have been fine." Dario looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You would not have been. That man crossing the room was Bruno Vasco. He puts women in shipping containers, Miss Frost, and by the time anyone finds them it is too late. He was not admiring your dress. He was pricing you." Delia went cold. "Then why me?" she whispered. "Why would you cross a room like that for a bookkeeper you've never met?" "Because I watched an entire hall of dangerous men look at you like a meal," Dario said, "and I watched you keep working anyway, with your hands shaking and your whole body trying to fold itself out of existence, and I have not seen courage like that in a very long time." His dark eyes moved over her face, not her body, her face. "And because you caught an error in that folder in the first 10 minutes and rechecked it twice, and not one person in that room but me noticed you were the only one doing anything real." Delia's throat tightened. Nobody talked to her about her mind. Nobody had ever once looked past the shape of her to the thing underneath. "It was just a dress," she said faintly, tugging at the hem again out of habit. Dario reached out, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such hands, he stilled her fingers before they could pull the fabric down. "Stop hiding," he said quietly. "Not from me." And Delia Frost, who had spent 29 years apologizing for the space she took up, felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed her whole life. He drove her home himself, which he had never done for anyone, and at her door he paused, and did not come in, and only said, "Keep the jacket. I will know you are warm." And he was gone, and Delia stood in her doorway holding a killer's coat, her heart pounding like a girl's, with no idea she had just become the most talked-about woman in the underworld overnight. What Dario had done in that hall did not stay in that hall. By morning, every family on the coast knew that the great Dario Rourke had crossed a room full of men to put his jacket on an unknown woman, and in that world such a gesture was not gallantry. It was a claim, a declaration as binding as a ring. And a claim made a target. Because Dario Rourke had enemies who had spent years looking for exactly one thing, a soft spot, a weakness, something the untouchable man might actually bleed for. And he had just stood up in front of all of them and shown them precisely where his heart was. In the weeks that followed, Dario did the thing that stunned his entire organization. He did not send the bookkeeper back to her back room. He brought her closer. He had her transferred to his own accounts, installed her under quiet protection, and set her loose on the tangled architecture of his empire. And Delia, who had spent 2 years hiding her genius in a windowless office, felt it come alive in the open air. She was extraordinary. She found leaks his own people had missed. She restructured his holdings in a week. And every night they worked side by side over that decanter of amber whiskey until the tall windows went gray with dawn, and Dario, who trusted no one, found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul, about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him. Those nights became the truest hours of his life. He would come home from something bloody and unspoken and find her at the kitchen table surrounded by ledgers, humming under her breath, and the hardness would drain out of him just to sit across from her and watch her work. He learned she hummed when she was thinking. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness. And it made him want to burn down everyone who had ever made her feel small. And one night, at her door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Delia thought he might kiss her, and instead he only looked at her, memorizing her, and murmured good night, and left her aching for a man the whole world feared. But Delia, being Delia, had also started to notice things. She noticed that a shipment out of the eastern terminal never reconciled cleanly. She noticed that a maintenance account had been bleeding small, patient sums for 2 years. And she noticed, most of all, the way one man went quiet whenever she entered a room, the boss's own consigliere, a smooth and silver-tongued man named Lucian who had served the family since Dario was young. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough to be frightened, because the numbers were telling her that someone inside the fortress had been selling Dario to his enemies for 2 years, and that the same someone had every reason in the world to want the sharp-eyed bookkeeper gone. The cruelty came at a commission dinner, wearing a beautiful face. Dario had seated Delia at his right hand in a gown of deep emerald that celebrated every curve she had spent her life apologizing for. And halfway through the evening, a sleek socialite named Portia, who had spent 2 years auditioning for the seat Delia now occupied, cornered her by the bar with an audience in tow. "God, it's actually you," Portia said, letting her eyes rake over Delia with theatrical pity. The little accountant in the slutty dress. "Sweetheart, everyone knows what you are." He needed something soft and stupid to warm his bed, and he found the plainest, roundest thing on the payroll and threw a coat on it. She smiled like a knife. "Nobody in this room looks at you and sees a queen. They see a charity case in borrowed silk." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. But Delia, who had spent her whole life absorbing exactly this, lifted her chin, and for the first time she did not shrink. "You're partly right," she said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect calm. "He did give me a coat. But you should know that while you spent tonight watching who he looks at, I spent it watching the books, and I can tell you which 3 men at this table are stealing from the families they came here to toast, and roughly how much, and since March." She tilted her head. "I don't need to be looked at like a queen, Portia. I only need to be the smartest person in the room, and I usually am." The silence had teeth. And Dario, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Delia's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of every capo in the city. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Kara," he murmured, using the endearment for the first time. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But across the room, Lucian watched the way his boss looked at her and understood that his time had just run out. That night, he made his move. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Delia woke to a silence so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct 2 years in a criminal enterprise had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators, which should have caught in seconds, stayed dead. Dario was gone, drawn to the docks at midnight by an emergency she now understood was a lie. And Delia, sitting up in the dark, understood with terrible clarity that whoever had come while the boss was away, and that they had come for her. She did not scream. She did not faint. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. Delia slid out of bed. She had spent weeks quietly learning this house the way she learned everything. And she knew 2 things the men on the stairs did not. She knew the study safe held a hardwired phone that ran on its own line. And she knew the study connected to the old servant's passage behind the bookcase. She reached the safe as boots hit the landing, entered the code Dario had trusted her with, and sent a single line to the only number that mattered. Then she did something better than hide. She turned the house against them. She reached the security panel on emergency battery and triggered the lockdown, slamming steel doors across the upper corridor, cutting the intruders in half, and sealing 2 of them in a hallway with no exit. Then she slipped into the passage and drew the bookcase shut behind her just as the study door splintered inward. "Find the girl," a voice snarled. Lucian wants it to look like a break-in. And Delia, crouched in the dark, understood at last whose hand had been in the books. Then she heard the smooth, unhurried voice of the consigliere himself, speaking to the darkness as though he could feel her in it. "Come out, Delia," Lucian said pleasantly. "You are a clever girl. You have surely worked out that I have been selling Dario for 2 years. And you have worked out that the moment he sees what you found, I am a dead man. So you understand my position. Nothing personal. You simply have a habit of seeing things you shouldn't." He was 3 feet from the bookcase. And Delia, crouched in the dark, did the one thing he never expected. She spoke. "You should have checked the safe before you came for me, Lucian," she said. Silence. "Because everything I found is already gone," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "Every shell company, every stolen shipment, every dollar you sent to his enemies, primed to reach Dario, and the whole commission unless I stop it myself. Kill me tonight, and you do not just lose your fortune. You expose yourself to every family on this coast as the man who sold his own blood." Lucian's certainty flickered. He had not planned for the bookkeeper to be armed with anything but numbers. And in his half-second of hesitation, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Dario had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Lucian spun toward the sound, and Delia, seizing the only moment she would ever get, drove the bookcase open with her full weight. The heavy oak caught him square in the chest and sent him crashing backward over the desk, his weapon skittering into the dark. She did not stop. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she knew exactly what to do with the half-second it bought her. She lunged, kicked the pistol under a cabinet, and then the study doors were kicked from their hinges and Dario filled the doorway, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Enzo, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with 4 armed men, and the trap Lucian had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Dario had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak, and his voice was a lethal whisper. "You came into my house for her." Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Lucian to Enzo's men and crossed the room in 2 strides. His large hands moved frantically over Delia's arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I'm all right," Delia wept, her fingers twisting in his soaked shirt. "I locked half his men in a hallway, and I hit the rest with a bookcase." Dario let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair. And then he framed her tear-streaked face in his trembling hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. "My own men missed him for 2 years, and you found him from a corner desk." Then his voice cracked open entirely. "I put my jacket on you that night because I could not stand to watch them look at you wrong," he said hoarsely. "I did not understand until this moment that I was already yours." Lucian, the man who had smiled at Dario for years while selling him to his enemies, learned the price of underestimating them before the week was out. Dario did not act in blind rage. He let Delia lay the entire elegant crime before the commission, every shell company, every stolen shipment, every dollar routed to his rivals, all of it reconstructed by the bookkeeper Lucian had dismissed as decoration. And when the 5 families had seen the proof, when even Lucian's own allies had gone silent, Dario looked at Delia, and she did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Lucian of every hidden asset, exposed his treason to the very families he had hoped to lead, and let them cast him out. He was left alive, bankrupt, disgraced, his name turned into a warning whispered across the underworld, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Bruno Vasco, the heavy man who had risen from his chair that first night to price her like meat, discovered that the soft woman he had leered at had spent one careful week mapping every crime he had ever hidden in the family's books, and she handed the whole of it to the enemies he had cheated and the authorities he had bribed. The man who trafficked women found himself hunted by everyone at once, undone not by a gun, but by the bookkeeper he had mistaken for prey, and the last thing his empire ever heard about him was that he had been ruined by the very woman he rose from his chair to price. And Portia, who had called her a charity case in borrowed silk, spent the rest of her life watching the seat she had wanted go to the woman she mocked, from the far end of every table. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Delia Frost stood on the terrace of the fortress running the legitimate half of an empire that had never been cleaner or more feared, and she did not hide anymore. She wore rich color now, tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 29 years apologizing for, and she no longer tugged at a single hem, because she had stopped believing there was anything about her that needed covering. Dario came out and stopped, simply to watch her, the way he had that first night across a crowded hall. "You're staring, Mr. Rourke," she said, a smile in her voice. "I will never stop staring at you," he said, crossing to her, and he lifted a fine wrap from a chair and laid it gently over her shoulders, the way he had that first night, except this time it was a gift and not a shield. "Do you know what I understood that night in the hall?" he said quietly. "A room full of dangerous men looked at you and saw something to take." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "I looked at you and saw the only person in the room worth protecting, and then you opened your mouth and I realized you had never needed protecting at all. You needed someone to finally stop looking at you wrong." He tilted her chin up. They stared at a dress. "I fell in love with a mind, and I would cross that room again, and every room after it, for the rest of my life." Delia looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had walked into that hall certain she was the wrong shape in the wrong dress, the woman everyone stared at for all the wrong reasons, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because she alone had ever offered a ruthless man something real, and because the night 100 men looked at her like a meal, one man had crossed the room and covered her, and then discovered she had been the most dangerous person there the entire time. She had felt every eye in the room before she felt his jacket on her shoulders. And by the end, every one of those eyes had learned to look away. If Delia and Dario's story of quiet protection, hidden worth, and hard-won vindication moved you, if you felt that shift in the room when the Mafia boss crossed the floor and covered her, and cheered when the overlooked bookkeeper turned out to be the most dangerous mind in the building, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the person the world looks at wrong is so often the one worth everything. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, What was your favorite moment in Delia and Dario's story?